Good to see you.
Where are you at?
I'm in the southwest corner of our bedroom with some homemade dividers, you know, so.
I see that.
Oh, yeah. Should probably have some flaming sheets or something like that, or trees or. How about you? Are you in the basement?
Actually, I am in my office.
Oh, wow.
Since no one else is here, I figured, hey, the office isn't contaminated.
Right.
What do you think, Jim? Do you want to give it a couple of another minute and see if a few more people join?
Yeah, let's give it a minute. Why don't we go ahead, Hannah, if that's okay?
Okay, get started. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Just to kind of kick a start here, on behalf of the Conference Steering Committee, we are welcoming you to the 10th Biennial Central United States Stewardship and Conservation Conference. So as many of you know, this was a conference that we were planning on hosting in person in Little Rock, Arkansas, and we pivoted and transitioned it. I'm going to hang on for 1 second, a couple people on mute here. Just a reminder, if you could put yourself on mute, that would be great. Thank you. So we transitioned quickly, and we were able to put on a series of about 15 or 17 really amazing presentations that we've been hosting throughout the past 2 weeks. It's been a big conference Zoom experiment for us, and we are really excited to see how it's going, and we encourage you that there'll be a survey about the conference afterwards, and we really encourage you to give us your candid feedback in case we need to do other online conferences in the future. Just a little bit of housekeeping. The session will be recorded, and we will be sharing this link along with all the conference links sometime in the next week or so. And I think with that, I will hand it over to Jim Smith. He's going to be facilitating the conversation, Data, Tools, and Metrics for Landscape Scale Management. Jim is the LANDFIRE project manager, and he is joined with his team today. And with that, I will hand it off to Jim.
Well, thanks very much, Hannah. We appreciate it. And I also want to thank Doug for organizing this and allowing us to participate, and Sandy Alloway for all the work she did organizing this. It's a thankless task. So Sandy's not on, but we really appreciate what she did, and Hannah for moderating. She's filling in for Zach Prusak, who could not be here. So thanks, Hannah, for jumping in at the last minute. All of you that are participating, we appreciate your time. We know your time is valuable. And hopefully we can begin a discussion about how we and others might be able to help you implement conservation on a landscape scale. We're the TNC LANDFIRE team. There's 3 full-time individuals and 3 part-time or shared positions on the LANDFIRE team. We're completely supported 100% by external grants and agreements and contracts and an occasional code of fellowship. But we're always still looking for ways to support our TNC colleagues and teams as much as we can. Our time is not unlimited, but we've been pretty successful over the past 16 years at supporting TNC when needed. And we certainly hope that if you think we can help you, that you will reach out to us and that we can help you. This is intended to be a conversation, but we hope to spend about 45 minutes or so, 30 to 45 minutes, sort of laying the groundwork that will initiate a conversation. So we do not plan to use the whole hour and a half as a presentation. We really want to set this up so that it's a conversation with you about the things that we've done, which may generate some ideas in your head about how we can support you. I'm going to begin with introductions of the people who are going to be presenting and the team members who are not here. So as Hannah said, I'm Jim Smith. I live and work out of Jacksonville, Florida. I am a complete unabashed data geek of all kinds. I don't care what form it's in. I love data. That's what I've been doing for 40 years, and hopefully we'll be doing it for a little while longer. I am the privileged leader of this incredible group for over 16 years now, and it has been a pleasure and a privilege to do that and to work with TNC colleagues. Not only do we work with LANDFIRE, but I will mention as we go down here through the introductions that we're also involved in many TNC teams and projects, as a part of our work. And I apologize up front. I sometimes don't get these team names exactly right. So please don't be offended if I get your team wrong. But I do want to make sure you understand that we are involved in the shared conservation agenda, in CBD2, and lots of things going on in TNC, despite the fact being completely externally supported. I'm involved with the Living with Fire Priority Strategy Implementation Team, as well as the Measures and Outcomes Team. So Randy will be our next presenter after this. He's going to play Stump the Chump with you. Randy is in Marquette, Michigan. He's an ecologist extraordinaire, a coder, a creative dynamo, and also a true man of the people. So we're looking forward to Randy giving you a bit of tour of a few of the things that he's been doing. And he's also been heavily involved in the last few months with the Global Improved Management Team, which has been a real challenge, a really interesting project for Randy to be involved in. Randy will be followed by Sarah Hagan. She's in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She's our sort of youthful driving force and our cartographic designer, spatial analyst, webmaster, and more. And she does all this while also being the spatial ecologist and support for the Illinois chapter, and has participated recently in the TNC Measuring Impacts team, another sort of challenging assignment for Sarah through a CODA fellowship. Our last presenter will be Corey Blankenship. Corey is in Bend, Oregon. She is a red-carded firefighter and former hotshot, so she knows what she's talking about with fire. She is an incredible fire ecologist, an accomplished data analyst and modeler, so you'll be hearing from her about some of the things that she has done with some of our TNC colleagues in the past. And finally, we have 2 teammates who will not be presenting today. Megan Dettenmeyer, who is our new kid on the block. She is in Reno, Nevada, and she is our communications guru in all things communications. And she's also serving as the co-editor with Zach Fertania, the TNC Chief Geospatial Information Officer, as the editor of the TNC GIS book. And I'll finish up with Kim Hall, who I think is on the call today, but will not be presenting. She is our climate scientist and Renaissance woman, worked on SNAP, drought, Doris Duke climate projects and support, and also the NASA CircuitScape project. So she won't be presenting, but certainly understand that she may have valuable contributions for you in other areas that we'll not cover today. Oops, I hit the wrong button. Okay. So we've sort of focused our presentation today around some demonstration questions. I'm going to talk about how we might be able to help you implement the shared conservation agenda and conservation community sort of in a very general overview kind of way. But then we're going to sort of focus in on 3 questions. Are there innovative approaches? Yes.
Sorry, I'm not seeing your screen. Are you sharing
Okay.
something you want to?
It must have gone off. Let me start again.
Okay.
Thank you.
I lost you at the questions.
Okay, let's try again.
Yeah.
How about that? Don't we all
Got it.
love the Zoom world? Everybody see it now? Okay. So I'm going to be quick and as quick as I can possibly be given my personality. Then I'm going to turn it over to Randy and Sarah and Corey to really zoom in on 3 particular questions. Are there innovative approaches that we've used to assess the current condition of a landscape? How can we determine perhaps what needs to be done on your landscape? And then how do you evaluate the effectiveness of alternative management scenarios? Those are the 3 questions we're going to sort of jump in on today. And then we're going to hopefully turn it over to you where you can help us identify what are the kind of things that you need to do that have not been covered. So I'm going to talk generally about some of the things that we do. So this is a blatant ripoff of the famous quote from the rhyme of the ancient mariner, you know, water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. Well, here, sometimes it feels like there's data everywhere, but not a byte that I can use. And sometimes you feel like you're in an ocean of data drowning, and sometimes you're in a desert of data and you can't find what you need. So one of the things that we do and we know about is a lot of different data sources. And yes, our first call would probably always be to LANDFIRE. We've been working on LANDFIRE for 16 years. It's an incredibly rich, thematically diverse database. It has something like all these rows in this chart here are different data products. These are all different versions representing different years in the columns. There are some specialized fire products, but most of these products can also be used outside of fire. And that's really probably where we focus, trying to help people understand what these data sets are. So that is where we turn first, but it's by no means the only data sets that we know about. There are tons of federal and other program data sets out there, like the Multi-Resolution Land Consortium data set that's typically called National Land Cover Data. Been around since the early 1990s and updated periodically since. There's a new program in the USGS called LC-MAP, Land Change Monitoring, Assessment, and Projection, that intends to actually continuously search for change every time a new satellite image from Landsat 8 is downloaded. It runs through a process to actually do a continuous change detection, not a snapshot. So these are things that we're aware of and sometimes even involved in. And there are other data sets I'm not going to go over. I want you to be aware that if you're searching for data and maybe need a little help, we might be able to find something for you. This is the Earth Explorer. If you haven't been to earthexplorer.usgs.gov, you probably want to do that. Probably thousands of data sets, imagery of all kinds, aerial, LIDAR, radar, satellite, etc. You can search by year. You can search by footprint. There are all these things that you could go to and maybe find some sort of data set that's useful to you. So we always sort of begin with the basic data. But then the real goal is about creating useful information from data. That's where we hope that we can also provide some value. You know, we have been involved not just in LANDFIRE and other programs like that, but also in Conserving's Nature Stage. Both the resiliency products as well as the terrestrial ecosystem mapping products. So we've had some involvement in those, and we certainly have some understanding of those. We've combined them with other data sets. On the bottom left here, you see a graphic illustrating the outputs of CircuitScape. I said Kim Hall's been involved in the CircuitScape project, supported by NASA, begun by Brad McCrae, and Kim has been involved in that. So, sort of looking at the connectedness of landscapes. Then there are all these sort of partner programs. These happen to be U.S. Forest Service. If you haven't heard of these and you partner with the Forest Service, we might be able to help you understand them a little bit. The Terrestrial Condition Assessment data set, which is produced, I don't know how often they're going to produce it, but it is a federal Forest Service project. It does use LANDFIRE data, but it uses a lot of other data sets too to sort of assess watersheds on the watershed level within national forest land. And then there's actually a separate watershed condition framework, called the Watershed Condition Class Framework, which we've also been aware of. So, there's a lot of things out there that you may not know about that we do, and we might be able to direct you to some of the things that might be useful to you. Now, once we've created useful information, I'd like to also sort of make the case that it's important to look at interesting ways to present data. That's always something that can sometimes really be helpful to you. And this is some R code that Randy, working with volunteers, has created. I think he's going to try to run through some different code. But this is actually, you probably can't tell it from here, but up here at the top, you can actually select a different ecological system and display what LANDFIRE says the reference condition was versus what LANDFIRE says the current condition is by different succession states. The gray bar indicating a historical amount of this succession state on the landscape, the green indicating the current. These gray bars don't have to be historical. They could be a desired future condition. So by clicking on this arrow, you could select different ecological systems and display them this way. And this is actually a powerful way to talk about what the condition of your landscape is. As I said, Randy and his volunteers have developed some R code to do this kind of work. This is another interesting development, which is called a chord diagram. And it's a way of connecting two sets of data. So on the right, you see LANDFIRE historical vegetation group, and on the left, current vegetation group. And the different bands or chords connect those. So I'll play a little video here that Randy created. And so you see the bands change as you move around the outside, and you can sort of display what it was, according to LANDFIRE historically, versus what it is now. And you can see how these different data sets are connected. So that's called a chord diagram, a pretty interesting way to display data. Here's another one that Randy generated, which I really like a lot. People learn visually. Some people do in different ways. And this kind of diagram really speaks to me. It's connecting forest height, I believe, might have been in Michigan. I might be getting that wrong. Maybe the UP or the lower peninsula, lower Michigan. But it's sort of showing how tree cover is distributed across the tree height classes. So you can see the predominant sort of mature height class here is predominated by one canopy cover category, 60 to 70%. And that might tell you something about your landscape that you would want to communicate to people. So these are some very interesting ways to display data, and we're actively sort of looking at those to find different ways to communicate current condition, or comparing current to past, or comparing current to desired future, or whatever that might be able to help you in your landscape management. So now I'm going to turn it over to Randy to talk about some of his innovative assessment approaches. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Jim, for that introduction. And thanks, everyone, for being here. We really appreciate your participation and the work you do. As Jim said, we're kind of all in the background, aiming to help you do the work on the ground that makes a difference to our conservation outcomes. as Jim told you, LANDFIRE delivers multiple data sets. So basically, a lot of them come out as rasters, meaning we break up the area into 30 meter by 30 meter squares or pixels. And across the United States, for the lower 48, there's over 9 billion of those pixels. So you're kind of like, now what? Each one of those pixels, if you look across all the different LANDFIRE data sets, could tell you a couple dozen different things. For example, you could click on a pixel and find out what the historical ecosystem was, or you could click on a pixel and find out what the canopy cover is, or canopy height is, or what the ecosystem is now. Fire behavior fuel models, several data sets. And we do not recommend that you do what I just said. We do not recommend you go pixel by pixel. Instead, LANDFIRE data is developed for large landscape scale assessments. So you look at an area of interest and get the data for that area, then make your charts or your tables and do other analysis. So I'm depicting here the LANDFIRE vegetation departure data sets. And technically it means that the darker areas are more out of whack. I love this term, you hear it all over the place, and I've never heard anyone say that the lighter areas are more in whack. It doesn't really work that way, but basically this displays the structural differences between our modeled historic structural characteristics of an ecosystem and what we find today. And with that, you know, we understand that we have to manage into the future. And so we're not here to say that any one reference condition is your desired future condition, but we work with these data sets to help you figure out what's on your landscape and how you might move forward. So what I'm going to do now is, what may have been a bit of a tease, you may have thought, oh, cool, I get to stump the chump. You get to later during the discussion section, but right now I'm probably going to stump myself. One way to work with the data is in the coding language R, and when working with these data sets, we're always looking for ways to automate that work. So actually, Kristen Blond, who's on the call today, hi Kristen, called me a while back and said that it would be useful if we could do some basic data work for the Black Hills area to look at historical fire regimes there, the ecosystems then and now, and some other characteristics. And so I thought this would be a good chance to try using R. So I'm going to just show you what that looks like really quick. I promise not to bore you for too long. A volunteer wrote some code that basically takes those big LANDFIRE data sets, clips it down to the area of interest, here the Black Hills, and spits out some outputs. Full disclosure, I did have students run this successfully, so I kind of think it's going to work. But I'm going to try it on my machine and have it going in the background. And I see a chat. I'm wondering if that's someone pointing out something that's not working. Oh, okay. Good question, Doug. We'll swing around to that in a moment. I wanted to make sure there wasn't a technical issue. So I'm going to hit go on this, and while I talk through a couple other slides, I'm going to hope the code works, and I hope to show you some outputs. So I'm going to hit this and hit run, and then, all right, it's starting to go. Here we are. I hope that's working while we go. So what I wanted to talk to you about while that's happening are a couple examples of things we like to do. So the Michigan chapter basically asked, Randy, can you make a map that shows us where the Northern Hardwood Forests are degraded? And the idea was, could they give me a rule set basically saying what degraded is, and could I map that? And I think we've got a pretty good first guess at this. So basically I combined the LANDFIRE historical data set, the biophysical settings, to say where Northern Hardwood's habitat is, like where they could occur based on climate, superficial geology, soils, and so on. Then on top of that, I laid the existing vegetation type to tell us where Northern Hardwoods still occur, and the canopy closure or cover. So the idea is that in the Northern Hardwoods, if the habitat's been converted to a plantation, that means a lot of investment in restoration. Or if canopy closure is less than 70%, that's unnatural. There's been either beech bark disease or super heavy harvest. Those areas need to be looked at. So we combined those data sets together. They gave me the rules to map by, and we made a map, and I chose a terrible color. Bright blues mean heavy investment. No, I'm not saying we need to invest in Lake Superior for this project. We need to invest in Lake Superior, but not for this project. I should have chosen a different color. But the maps help us decide. Basically what I say is where to take a truck ride. We're not telling you which pixel to go plant trees on. We don't go that level of detail, but we help set the sidebars, sort of understand the magnitude of the issue, and just get an overall look at things across your landscape. So we're spreading this across the Upper Peninsula. I zoomed in to the Michigamme Highlands in the Central Upper Peninsula. But we really appreciate getting those questions. So thanks, Michigan staff, for this, and I hope it's helpful. As Jim said, we are all data geeks, and we'll cross the aisle, so to speak, when we can. So we are not social scientists or economists, but we'll play with that data when given the chance. So I was asked by some World Office people if I could make some maps of unemployment for March 2019 and March 2020, and several other metrics to start building a case for sort of COVID stimulus money spending. So we looked across different natural resource sectors and how the economy is going up or down based on COVID. So this was fun, and I made a quick interactive map. They can click on polygons and get information, and they can share this and build a dashboard if they want. And I really appreciate, again, them asking me, and I appreciate, you know, Jim giving me the time to give this a go. We try to be as one conservancy as we can. So we can do this sort of work, and we like to do that. Okay, so this section might be really short. I'm going to see if we got any output. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to see if I can bring this over. All right. I'm going to stop sharing and then reshare just to make sure you see my screen. It looks like I have some outputs. So I'm happy, Kristen. It looks like we have some outputs. So while I was talking, the code spit out a reference map. You know, shows us where we clip the data to. I'll zoom out. The Black Hills, it has this line through the middle of it, which I'm going to need to look at. It spits out several tables. I'm going to open this up, and you know, I'm not going to give you a big tour of this, bore you to death, but basically these are the historic biophysical or ecosystems for the Black Hills, and we get acres, hectares, and relative percent. So we get several charts. I'm going to open up a bar plot. Miles, the volunteer, you know, whipped up these charts, the code for these charts. So while I was talking to you, my computer made these charts. So cool. I love it. So we find out historically, LANDFIRE says that the Northwestern Great Plains mixed grass prairie was the dominant ecosystem for the Black Hills. Spoiler alert for you, Kristen, you probably already knew all this, but in the current data set, the existing vegetation type, we have a switch. We have the prairie a second. So that, I love it. So either, you know, there's been succession, there's been some type conversions, or maybe LANDFIRE didn't get the mapping right. So I love showing this and seeing that this is the case because it brings up great conversations for us in the Black Hills, I hope. You know, we get to explore this, question this, see what we think, see if this is right. Now I'm going to go into one more chart, look at the mean fire return interval. We find that the Black Hills had a lot of fire historically. So basically over 50% of the Black Hills would see fire every 11 to 15 years. Yeah, again, I think the folks on the ground often know this stuff, but being able to quantify it, chart it, map it is really powerful. So with that, that is the end of my slides, and I will go and turn it over to Sarah Hagan. Okay, I've stopped sharing. I think it's all you now, Sarah. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Well, thanks, Randy. And hi, everyone. I just want to echo Jim and Randy's thanks to all of you for being here today, and kind of thank them both for a quick introduction to LANDFIRE and our data so that I can dig into things a little bit more with you. I'm going to talk to you today about how we use LANDFIRE in the Illinois Fire Needs Assessment. And so, little quick preview, you'll see, we'll talk more about this at the end, but basically, we use LANDFIRE to give us a baseline of how many acres historically burned each year across the various ecosystems in Illinois. And this baseline was really important as it allowed us to then measure the gap between how much of the landscape we should be burning and how much we are actually able to burn in a given year. And on it, the process is a very simple one, using LANDFIRE's data on historic and current vegetation and mean fire return intervals, which is a data set that measures the average period between fires under the presumed historic fire regime. So we'll talk through that a little bit more. So a note really quickly about biophysical settings, which is the reference ecosystems. We just want to say in this instance, we're not looking at climate change. We're not necessarily saying that reference conditions are the same as desired future conditions, but we still think this data set is useful. In some ecosystems, departure from reference conditions means higher vulnerability to climate change. We can look to reference versus current conditions to assess what we might need to do. And this, on the side here is just a little information on this. So for the whole U.S., LANDFIRE described how over 1,300 ecosystems looked and worked prior to European settlement, and we break things down into succession classes defined by the species, the percent cover, the height of the vegetation, and then we use some vegetation dynamics models to model the percentage of each, and you'll hear a little bit more about that in Corey's part of the talk. So in this map, really quickly, the large pale yellow colored patches are the central tallgrass prairie, historic extent in Illinois. The light purple is the north central interior dry music oak forest, so little oak forest and woodland type. And those were really the two most common systems on the landscape in Illinois. There's a mosaic of some other landscape types mixed in kind of the southern third of the state down here, and also up here in the northwest corner. And then you'll see a few different things in our riparian corridors that run through. But we use the LANDFIRE biophysical settings to get an idea of what the historic vegetation breakdown was across the state. So kind of how many acres were in each of these vegetation types. And as we expected, the state was really dominated by the tallgrass prairie, central tallgrass prairie, and the oak forest and woodland. So what we see here are kind of the 5 most widely spread ecosystem types historically, and we'll keep a focus on these 5 types as we kind of move through what we did. Next, we looked at existing vegetation, which is very different. In this slide, this is looking at the species composition that was currently present at the site. It's a few years old, so it's probably not very much different, but it could be a little different now. The table, again, we see the 5 most widely spread historic ecosystem types, and you can see the acreage figures have changed drastically since settlement, unsurprising probably. They're all far less dominant on the landscape, which meant we needed to adjust our numbers for how many acres we expect to burn in each of these types in each year, because if we, all of this yellow here that you see is now agriculture, and all of the red is urban areas, so Chicago up here and various urban areas, and so we can't expect fire in those systems, and so we had to kind of adjust our numbers. So what we did is essentially match the extent of these biophysical settings to the current vegetation. So where do the non sort of altered man-made landscapes exist, and then what are the acres of that historically of those areas that were in these ecosystems. So you see where these are the numbers we're looking at when we've excluded agriculture and urban areas from analysis. So we still have a good amount of tallgrass prairie and oak forest and woodland, but you'll see that the oak forest and woodland is now the predominant landscape type, with some patches of tallgrass prairie which are in this really light yellow color. It's hard to see, but the purple is still the oak forest and woodland, and it's really along the river and kind of stream riparian corridors in the state. And obviously a lot of the tallgrass prairie was lost due to conversion to agriculture. That's sort of the case across most of the middle part of the US, so not shocking. This here is what we call the mean fire return interval, and it quantifies the average period between fires under the presumed historic fire regime, so what the fire regime was in those pre-settlement landscapes. And we get this information from our vegetation dynamics models and the biophysical settings data layer. And so in this map, darker red colors are more frequent fire return interval. Yellow and greens have less frequent. So as you can see here, most of the state was in a fairly frequent fire return, and that's again unsurprising, with most of the landscape being tallgrass prairie. So what we did is we merged this mean fire return interval with the LANDFIRE existing vegetation types. So assuming we have a 3-year fire return interval in the central tallgrass prairie, we kind of multiply the acres by the fire return interval, or sorry, divide the fire acres by the fire return interval and get how many acres should burn each year. So if we presume there's an equal number, there's a few assumptions being made, right? So you take this acres figure, divide it by 3, that's how many acres of that type should be burning per year. And that let us look at that number by vegetation type, which meant that we could make a more informed decision on management and prescribe burning based on what the landscape looks like in a given area. And so again, we're looking at these 5 vegetation types and kind of how many acres should burn across the state with historic fire. That got us what we call our historic baseline, but we needed to update that to kind of more closely match the current reality. And so what we did is we surveyed fire managers across the state, and this table shows our updated fire return intervals and fire needs in the 5 most widespread classes. We did this for everything, but I'm just showing you these top 5. And we asked a couple questions, and one was, what would be the fire return interval to maintain good quality examples of a given vegetation class? And then also, what would the fire return interval be to restore a somewhat degraded example of that vegetation class? If we were trying to restore tallgrass prairie from something that was overgrown and shrubby and had a lot of invasives, the kind of average responses were that it would take fire every 2 years versus maintaining a good quality already either remnant prairie or already restored prairie, probably 3 years. And so you can see these numbers are in some cases quite different. Like these, the north central interior maple basswood and the south central interior mesophytic forest. So you can see if they're in good shape, it's kind of once every 7 years we want to burn, and then if not, if we're trying to restore it, we got to burn it more frequently to kind of knock the brush back in the understory and all of that. And so we really truly relied on the knowledge of our experts in these systems across the state. It was really a large survey group, and we had really good response to that. So we'll circle back to these next 3 maps again. And so you can see, again, the darker the red is kind of more intense, more frequent fire. And so these are showing you kind of the number of acres that would burn each year, and roughly the location. Under each of these, so you can see, we identified a lot more fire when we look at the current picture on the landscape than we did with the historic baseline. And so if we had gone with this historic, it's a somewhat accurate picture, but I think not as accurate as what we were seeing in terms of what realistically is needed to restore a landscape. And what we then did after this is we took this as our baseline of looking at how much fire should be happening on the ground in Illinois in each of these systems every year. And then we were able to then do another survey to ask the same fire managers, how much fire are you actually putting on the ground each year? How much are you actually able to burn in each of these systems? And it kind of allowed us to identify the gaps and where we were truly lacking in capacity or equipment or funding or any number of things to to really boost our fire. And the Illinois Prescribed Fire Council has been able to take that and track our progress towards trying to get to these numbers that we've identified in the fire needs assessment. So that's a really quick intro to that. We've got a lot more. There's a whole very long paper you can read if you're interested. But I'm going to now turn things over to Corey to talk a little bit more about ecological modeling.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, everyone, for sticking with us. I'll be the last presenter. And then we'll get on to some discussion and your questions. All right. So thanks again for being here. I am going to switch gears a little bit from GIS data and talk about a set of ecological models. Now, I think all the other presenters before me, my teammates, have kind of foreshadowed these ecological models that underlie a lot of the spatial data that LANDFIRE uses. So now we're going to get into a little bit of the details of those. First, I'm going to give you kind of a crash course into these models. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty, but we can do that in the Q&A if you want, or take the discussion offline later. So start with that brief introduction, and then I'm really going to focus on some examples of how these models are used in management and conservation contexts. All right, here's your crash course. Now, I've referred to these generally as ecological models. More specifically, the type of modeling I'm going to talk about is known as state and transition modeling. So what you see here on your screen are a set of states that comprise a sagebrush ecosystem. So 5 discrete states are defined. You can think of these as several stages or succession classes. But in this case, in the sagebrush system, after a fire, you'd begin with an herbaceous stage. Over time, the shrub component would come in. And then eventually, with a lack of fire, you might get juniper in the system or pinyon. Now, those are the states. Of course, there also are transitions in any state and transition model. These black arrows represent transitions with growth. So when the ecosystem grows over time in the absence of disturbance, this is the trajectory. We also add transitions to represent various disturbances, in this case, fire and drought. And these arrows show the direction of that change when an event, a fire event or a drought event occur. Now, what's not shown here is that each of these arrows also has a probability. So we're modeling the frequency of each of these events over time. So then when we run the model, we can project out and look at what the landscape does and how it changes over time. Now, LANDFIRE has built a collection of these models representing more than 1,000 ecosystems across the United States. And today I'm going to share some examples of how we've used the LANDFIRE models and then other types of state and transition models, because we're not the only ones who do this type of modeling. My first example is looking at modeling natural range of variability. So LANDFIRE models represent the condition of the landscape prior to European American settlement. These models help us to understand kind of quote unquote the natural structure and function of ecosystems. Here we've done a proof of concept to look at the historical range of variability in the tall grass prairie. So what you're seeing along the x-axis are the states in the state and transition model. There's a post-fire state where your grasses are just coming back. A few years post-fire, you'll have this unburned herbaceous prairie. And then the final stage is an unburned thatch accumulation where you might even start to get some woody encroachment into the ecosystem. Along the y-axis is the amount of the landscape that would be in that particular state. And you see both the mean and what we've modeled as the possible historical range. So what the graph shows is that the first two states, those prairie phases, really could have varied quite a bit on the landscape. For example, the post-fire state might occupy anywhere between 30 and 60% of the landscape. In contrast, this unburned thatch stage was probably fairly restricted on the landscape historically. Now, to echo my colleagues, natural range of variability or historical range of variability is not a goal everywhere, but it can help us understand current conditions and provide a baseline from which to measure change. So that's where we'll take off with this next example. Here we're looking at a comparison of reference versus current conditions in an Ozark oak woodland ecosystem. Again, along that x-axis, you're seeing the various states from the state and transition model. The reference, or white bars, show what we modeled as the historical reference condition, and the black bars show what we mapped as current condition, because LANDFIRE can map each of these seral stages or states on the landscape today. What we see here is that historically, the Ozark oak woodland would have been dominated by these open canopy oak forests. That may have occupied up to 50% of the landscape historically. But today, we're seeing over 50% of the landscape in this closed canopy state. So the logical next question then is, well, what are we going to do about that, if anything? So some people have taken these models and tried to address that question, to analyze, well, what treatment options do we have? The example here comes from a paper by Taylor and others, and they're looking at the Wyoming sagebrush steppe. This was a model that they built partially using LANDFIRE data as inputs. And you can see that not only have they incorporated growth and natural disturbances, but along the bottom here they have some arrows representing possible treatments such as prescribed fire, sagebrush removal, herbicide and reseeding. So there's some management actions that you could take to change the ecosystem condition to a more desired state. Also notice these yellow arrows represent treatment failures. We know that not every treatment will be successful, and for this modeling effort, it was important to represent that a percentage of the time we won't be successful. Each of the management options here is tied to a budget, so you can only implement so much treatment at any given time. And again, that failure rate is important because you don't, not every dollar you spend on restoration or any of these management actions is effective, but you've still spent the money. So in this particular example, for this study, the authors found that fuel treatments are fairly effective in the healthy sagebrush and even the decadent sagebrush phase. But once you get to that annual grass-dominated phase, it's not very cost effective to treat the landscape. So what I'd hope that you will see here is that these ecological models are a great way to test possible outcomes of alternative management strategies. Now, our colleagues in Nevada have taken this even one step further. Louis Provencher and other colleagues in Nevada have developed this method that they call landscape conservation forecasting. And what this does, or the goal of the method, is to identify an optimal suite of management actions that maximizes an ecological return on investment. So the basis of this technique is the ecological models where they analyze the treatments. What you see here is a group of 4 different ecosystems, and they've compared 2 different management strategies. First, they have a no management strategy, but no management actually does include fire suppression because generally on federal landscapes, they're obligated to do fire suppression. So no management except fire suppression. And then the next column is looking at what they call the return on investment management. So they've analyzed various scenarios. This is the one that they think is their best strategy that maximizes their ecological return on investment. And then down these columns, what you see are numbers representing the departure or the condition of each ecosystem. So boxes that are shaded yellow mean, well, let's start with green actually. Green means the ecosystem is in good condition, similar to its historical reference. Yellow means it's somewhat departed from the historical reference condition, and yellow, or the darker yellow-orange here, means that it's highly departed from the reference condition. So what you see is that when you do no management with fire suppression, this is the condition of the landscape, and when you implement this ecological management strategy, you can improve the condition of your landscape. Now the final column here is a return on investment measurement. And the higher the number, the higher your return on investment. So in this case, the montane pine forest really maximizes the bang for your buck and reduces ecological departure. This technique has been used on a variety of different landscapes, both conservancy and federal landscape. And I think it's also important to note that the technique is often used collaboratively. So stakeholder groups can participate in the modeling, in building the management scenarios, and then have more buy-in on eventual proposed solutions using this technique. All right, I would be remiss if I did not address climate change. These types of models can be used to look at climate change impacts, especially related to changes in natural disturbance regimes. And what I'm showing here is that our team has built a website that looks at how you can use state and transition models to represent current conditions. And we do have a section on modeling climate change, as well as some other advanced options, including spatial modeling. I've provided the link to the website here. It's not quite final yet, but you can go and explore it. And if you have questions, definitely contact us about it. So I will end there and turn it back to Jim.
Yeah, thank you, Corey and Sarah and Randy. So now I'd like to sort of turn the tables a bit and sort of get some discussion about the things that you do and the data sets that you need, or analyses or displays or whatever. So we did have a couple of questions in the chat, and I'll start with those while you're thinking about your part in this conversation. Doug asks, how do we get this team to work on a particular project with us? And that's pretty much, you just come to us and ask, and we do everything we can to help. So it is a part of our agreement with the LANDFIRE program that we support our colleagues in TNC. That has a limit, but we haven't had to turn very many people down, I don't think. We can't become your permanent GIS analyst, but we can do things ad hoc, things that you may need. You just have to come and ask, and hopefully we'll be able to help. So then Hannah asked Randy how he found the volunteer to do the R code, and beyond his sparkling personality, I will let him answer that question.
Yeah, thanks for that, Hannah. I wish I had a straightforward answer for you. It's been extremely random. Every person I've met has been through a different pathway. Usually word of mouth, and there is a university here in Marquette, so like half the volunteers I work with come from there, but some of them, you know, I met their mom on a plane or at the grocery store or something. It's very random, but I do have a group of volunteers that are ready to help with projects. And I'm kind of the middle person. So basically, like with the example I showed with the Black Hills, Kristen had a question. I kind of manage, if you will, the volunteers, and then they will present to Kristen and colleagues. I think it's Monday. So it's just fun to see how that turns out. But they come from all over the place, Hannah. And if you have a project that you would like to engage a volunteer with, let me know. I've got a couple that are looking for projects.
So you've had a second or two to think. Does anybody have any questions? I see one popping up now. All right. Okay. So Kevin, I'm gonna start from the bottom. Do you have any wildlife data along with the vegetation data? No, there is no specific wildlife data sets. We have had people like in the GAP program and others utilize our data with their habitat models and things like that to do some wildlife studies or to do long-term ecosystem studies, but there is no specific data related to wildlife, insect, or avian or mammals or anything in the LANDFIRE data set.
One thing we might add is that a really interesting product that LANDFIRE creates is called the disturbance, it's like recent disturbance events. And so we do have a map that would include insect outbreaks, for example, where they're reported, as well as other current disturbances like where have we had fire, where has there been logging, where have there been herbicide applications and things like that. So that's a really interesting set. And I know that's probably not what you're getting at, but since you included that word insect, I think I thought I'd just chime in that we do map insect outbreaks.
And Kevin, just so you know, is the dynamic models that Corey described have been used to model wildlife habitat. You can give them scores. There are things that you can do with those models. I know it was done in Canada with bison. And so I do think there are some opportunities, but our data sets don't inherently contain them, I guess there's some opportunities, but they're not a part of the native data. Let me go back up here. How feasible, from Hannah, how feasible is it to expand the scope of fire needs assessments? And that's very feasible. The LANDFIRE data is coast to coast, all lands, no gaps. And a lot of, for instance, the southern risk assessment is based on LANDFIRE fuel. The Northeast risk assessment, region 9, let's call it the region 9, U.S. Forest Service risk assessment does use LANDFIRE fuels. Now they did adjust them for some differences that they would like to have shown. So these are already being used for national regional products. The Wildland Fire Hazard Potential Map, which is a national map, utilizes LANDFIRE data, as does the Wildfire Risk to Communities data set. All those large data sets typically do use LANDFIRE because it pretty much is the only coast-to-coast Alaska, Hawaii, major insular island territory data sets that are available. So it is perfectly feasible, Anna, to do that. As you get more people involved, of course, it gets harder, but it is feasible to do that. So I don't see any other questions. Oh, I see one. I'm sorry.
And then there's a follow-up to Hannah's question about how likely federal partners are to accept a product like this. Great question, Hannah. And I would say it's variable. And I think that, yeah, Jim, Corey, everybody else on the team can give their perspective too. I feel like acceptance of LANDFIRE is improving over time as we try to improve the data sets, as we try to listen more and take feedback, and as projects successfully use LANDFIRE data. Also, we've been around a while. You know, at first people thought, oh, this is another 2-year project, whatever. But we've been around a while now. So I think acceptance is going up. And I really liked both Corey and Sarah's examples because they really brought in experts, and that really helped. So with Sarah, they modified some of the fire expectations. And Corey talks about modeling, which is a good way to bring in people's opinions, knowledge, background. I have a long answer, but it's highly variable.
And Randy, I'll start with a question from Kristen, but you can jump in, or Kim. Basically, have you interacted much with the team that worked on terrestrial resilience mapping, which I presume is the conserving nature stage type of projects, the Eastern Conservation Science team led by Mark Anderson? That working, we have had some interaction with them. Kim was working, I believe, in the Great Lakes and the Great Plains groups that worked on the basic resilient connected networks data sets. Now, the LANDFIRE data is not integrated into those data sets, nor is it the vice versa true. They're both based on ecological systems, the same classification, but the mapping processes were quite different. The goals were quite different. There are some differences in those products, but there are also some great similarities. So there is some interaction with them, but they're not really duplicative. They each have their sort of own little niche, and their two little circles in the Venn diagram overlap just a little bit, but not a lot. I don't know, Randy or Kim, would you add anything to that?
Hey, this is Kim. I could jump in just a little bit. Yeah, I worked on the Great Lakes and Great Plains, as Jim said, and I think that there's a lot of interesting things that we could do to crosswalk the two. But the resilient and connected network data, they basically just look at whether it's natural or not in general in terms of how the sites are scored. And so we're not breaking things down into what type of vegetation is on the system, but more just trying to understand the degree of human modification, which certainly has a strong connection to what LANDFIRE is doing, but it's really some different lines of evidence on how you get there. I think that we could do a lot to try to understand whether the predictions that the RCN is suggesting in terms of the number of different ecosystem types per particular land unit, increasing with the complexity of your topography and the local connectedness, the key indicators of resilience in Mark's approach. We could do a lot to test that with LANDFIRE data, and I think that would be really fun.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. Yeah, what Kim just said is something I've thought of doing a few times. I have not had the time to do it, but I do think that would be an interesting exploration of looking at how many ecosystem types are mapped by LANDFIRE in a certain areas based, and then kind of check that against what is predicted in the resilient and connected networks. I will also add that we have in the Midwest division integrated some LANDFIRE information on vegetation departure into some of the resilient landscapes data to start thinking about the potential for improved management on landscapes. And so looking at places that are in resilient and connected states, but maybe need some work or could be elevated into being a connected landscape if we did some restoration work. And so there are also some interesting intersections that we've explored. I don't think the video is live yet, but we did a presentation to the Midwest Division staff that will be on our YouTube channel soon, so you can watch a little bit more about that to hear kind of more details on that, or I'm happy to speak to you about it.
Okay, anything else on that question? Okay, Kristen asked about a primer to this group on where to find the supporting metadata. So I will tell you that this is a federal project. It is required to create FGDC compliant metadata. That can be pretty messy stuff and not easy to read, but it is there on the landfire.gov website. Each data product has a metadata in I think HTML. Maybe somebody looks like they're going there. Thank you. To show you that metadata does exist. And I would also say that it does describe the data. It is FGDC compliant, but sometimes metadata is not sufficient. You know, there's a lot of nuances. So if you have any questions about the applicability of the data or its characteristics, you know, let us know and we'll try to help you. And by the way, that's not just LANDFIRE data, that's other data sets as well. So the metadata is on the website. If you see the data products tab there, each data product will have a set of metadata that you download. By the way, it also comes with the product if you download it directly from the LANDFIRE website. It's automatically packaged, so you have to get it. You don't have to read it, but you have to get it. Okay, from Kelly, is the LANDFIRE veg data set fine enough to break down the species? So the real answer to that is no. The veg data for LANDFIRE is going to just say something like introduced annual grassland or something like that as an ecological system type. Remember, we map ecological systems, and cheatgrass is not a native ecological system, so it'll be called something like introduced annual grassland. However, there are events in our data, what we call our events data, that were submitted that will have species level information about known invasive species on the landscape. So while it's not a type in the veg map, if it was submitted to us as an invasive species as a part of our mapping process, you can find that data under our reference database tab. And if you want to look into that, let me know and I will direct you to the place on the website where you can find that data. I hope that was clear, okay? So Kristen, working from the Dakotas was whether we could use it to assess vegetation departure specifically for riparian areas. So I don't know, Randy, I hope you'll join in. It has been used in some other states, like Utah, for a statewide riparian area assessment. But it probably does vary a bit depending on your local conditions. So yes, that is possible. But just like most other things, we need to do a data review. How does the data look? Does it have the riparian areas mapped decently? So yes, that has been done in the past. I think there was one done in Utah. Does anybody remember that, Randy? I think that's right.
Yeah,
you'll find it on
Utah
our
State
applications map.
Yeah, we should look into that, Kristen. I would be really curious to see how it would hold up in South Dakota. Usually those areas are well, kind of small, but in South Dakota they might not be so small. I don't know. So we should look at that. That's a good question. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. So let us look into that with you sometime, okay? Because it certainly could be done. That in the past, LANDFIRE aggregated riparian and wetland types pretty heavily. But in the new remap product, they really separated out many different riparian and wetland types than they did in previous versions. So we should look at that with you. Okay, new metrics for the SCA. This is from Doug, especially around improved management. The scale is so large nowadays, I need an easier way to track it. So I don't know, Randy and Sarah have both thought a lot about improved management. Would you like to chime in on that?
Yeah, I was thinking about your question, Doug. I really like what the Michigan chapter asked me about the Northern Hardwoods.
Yeah.
It was very straightforward, and so it made me think for larger scales, it would be kind of cool. It'd be, in some ways, it would feel like a step backwards, but I think for the broad ecosystem types, we could develop rule sets. You know, if you've got, oak hickory forests, if canopy cover is more than 70%, maybe conditions declining, something like that. I'm making this up, but we're not going to get a salamanders or species composition very well. Right. But I've wondered about, wonder if we could do that, create just for broad ecosystem groups, some rule sets that you could get at with LANDFIRE or other data, for sure. It'll be interesting to combine it, as Kim and others were talking about earlier, with the resilient and connected lands. That's where the focus is. But Yeah, good question. I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how that evolves. There are other people in the Nature Conservancy definitely trying to think of how to map this. And I think everybody's finding it's harder than you think.
Yeah,
It is.
I've been
I
working.
found it is.
I've been working with the Chief Strategy Office on tangentially related work on kind of trying to measure the impact of TNC land. So tracking, like we don't have any data, right, on how landscapes have changed where TNC owns land. And so we're trying to retrofit a lot of things into TNC North America lands to see if we can measure, like, is there a measurable difference in what we've done? And so part of this has come out in looking at ecosystem conditions, which is something LANDFIRE's done a lot. So Randy and I are working with that team to think through whether there are ways that we can look at the conditions of ecosystems and identify areas where we have done improved management or we need to do improved management, and kind of trying to roll all of that into the SCA. But yeah, it's not easy, and I think there was an expectation kind of by this group, that the strategy office group that I'm working with, that like, oh, we can just pull this land cover data and look at this and this and this, and then we'll have the answer. And they're quickly realizing that that is not the case. So I think we're all kind of fumbling through it right now.
All right, next question. Do any of the data layers you use include past land use management by Native Americans? So Kevin, the biophysical settings layer, which is the pre-European settlement vegetation ecological system, does include Native American land management practices, particularly burning. That was included as an acceptable disturbance for pre-European settlement modeling and mapping of biophysical settings. So all of our descriptions of biophysical settings and the biophysical settings map does include something, at least burning. Maybe there might be some others, clearing, but Native American practices are included in those. And that, by the way, wasn't always acceptable to everyone across the nation. There were, you know, when you're trying to do things like this across the nation, it's perfectly fine in one part of the country, and other part of the country, somebody up in arms because you included Native American burning. So we decided to include it, but the nice thing about these models is if you don't want to include it, you go in and turn it off and rerun the model, and it's not included anymore. So they are there, although I would not say it's extensive. It is included as a part of these data sets. I'm going to circle down. Thanks for all the compliments. We appreciate that. And I know there's toddler wisdom going on here. I remember that when I had small children. So congratulations, Natalie. A couple of people have pointed out the descriptive documents that we have for the ecosystem types. And I do want to remind you that those are pre-European settlement. They are not current. We sometimes get that confusion from people that they think, oh, that's not how it works today. But that wasn't the intent of these documents. They're pre-European settlement. They're intended to represent the average conditions across a national land cover database map zone. And there's only 66 of those in the lower 48 in the US. So it is an average product, but they are the models as well as the documents themselves. We're trying to make them easy for you to modify locally should you need to. And that landscape conservation forecasting that Corey described actually is reliant upon stakeholder ability to understand those descriptions and those models and make changes to them. It won't work without that. So this is all intended to be at the level of use by you and others at a more local level. I think that's all the questions that I see. Are there any final questions from anyone that wants to unmute and just chime in? We would appreciate anything you have. And I would tell you again that, you know, while we don't have 100% free time, the best thing we do every day is somehow or another help our TNC partners and colleagues to find data, to use it appropriately, to try to create useful information out of those data sets and products that are out there. So hopefully we've generated a few ideas in your head that you can spring from it and contact us. There is another question, so I will answer it as best I can. And I don't know, Kim or somebody else might chime in. Has the team worked with the American Forest Carbon Initiative? And I'm going to say no, I'm not aware of that name. We've worked with some other carbon projects like Land Carbon from the U.S. Geological Survey. We've worked with some climate hubs. What's the NIACS? What is that? Yeah. So sometimes I get confused by the different acronyms. So Kim, do you want to answer that, and Randy?
I can give you the definition of NIACS, and Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science.
Okay.
I don't know that we've directly done carbon work with them, but they're good friends. We also, gosh, I'm going to forget names this morning. Gave some feedback to TNC's mapping of carbon opportunities through restoration. But I'm not,
Are you
I don't
thinking
think we've connected.
Susan Cook-Patton and
Yeah.
the reforestation potential? Yeah, I was going to mention that. So some LANDFIRE data underlies the reforestation potential because they wanted to know what areas are suitable for forests, and we help them identify areas suitable for forest using LANDFIRE vegetation data. I hope, Isaac, too, since this is supposed to be a discussion, if you want to unmute and share more with us, feel free to do that.
Oh, sorry about that. Trying to unmute. Not much more to say. I just know that it's a TNC carbon initiative, and they're looking for, yeah, like you were saying, opportunity zones of where to put carbon projects, both large size and at just a small owner level. Sounds like the type of thing that some data sets would be really useful for.
Thank you, Isaac.
Yeah, we have all that underlying vegetation data. So if you can link the vegetation to an estimation of the carbon, it's a good starting point. And it has been used in a couple of cases like that.
So Corey, would you go to the last slide now? I think you still have control.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to sort of wrap this up. First of all, Doug, I think this is a photograph from a nicely restored oak ecosystem in Arkansas.
It is.
Yeah, so this is an example of the work of the Arkansas chapter, and it's a beautiful, beautiful place. And we want to thank you all for being a part of this particular science and stewardship meeting and our presentation. And there are a lot of ways to learn about LANDFIRE. We do have a Twitter account, nature_LANDFIRE. We have a YouTube account, which has a lot of our previous webinars, even some instructional videos and things like that on YouTube. We have an extensive presence on Conservation Gateway. And then there's a general mailbox that we monitor here in TNC called LANDFIRE@tnc.org. LANDFIRE is primarily a federal program. We are partners in it. It's primarily a program of the Department of Interior Office of Wildland Fire and U.S. Forest Service Fire and Aviation Management. But TNC was a part of the proposal process. Ann Schliske, if anybody remembers Ann, and Kelly Pale, and others were a part of the proposal process that started LANDFIRE, as well as Fire Learning Network and Fire Adapted Communities, and all those things go back a long ways. And while we're not officially we're part of the business lead group of this, really federal programs that we support. And we hope that you will contact us directly. The people that you saw on here, you can probably figure out what all our emails are, except don't send it to jsmith@tnc.org because he's a trustee in Colorado. So make sure you do DM_Smith Okay. We also have a monthly email that we push to you if you subscribe. So you'll get one a month. We don't spam you. You'll get one a month. It's not very long, but that's to keep you up on the latest developments of LANDFIRE. So I think with that, I'm going to say that we're through, and I'm going to stop recording unless there are any final questions or comments. Anna, you want to wrap up?
Thank you, Jim, and thank you all of the presenters. As I mentioned, the recording will get tied in with all of the recordings from the rest of the conference, and so you'll be able to share it with colleagues that may have missed today, or if you wanted to revisit parts of it. And so with that, just thank you very much, everyone, and hope you have a great rest of the day.